My daughter-in-law hit me with a broom. My son laughed and said I shouldn't call 911 because it might upset her. I stood there frozen. The bruise faded in a few days, but something inside me cracked wide open. I had sold my bookstore. I gave up everything to be with them. But in that moment, I realized I had become invisible. So I packed one bag and I started walking towards something I never thought I'd find again. What happened next changed more than just my life. The bookstore had been my life for 40 years. I sold my first novel there. I held Travis in one arm and shelved books with the other. That place knew my laughter, my grief, my winters, my beginnings. But after the small stroke last October, I knew something needed to change. The doctor called it a warning. I called it a door creaking closed. I locked the shop for the last time on a Thursday. It was raining the way it used to on spring afternoons, soft and persistent. I didn't cry, but my hands lingered on the lock longer than necessary, as if muscle memory wanted one more morning coffee among paperbacks and old floorboards. That evening, while sorting through the final boxes in the back room, I found an envelope I didn't recognize. It was tucked beneath a copy of the second chapter, my unfinished manuscript. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. It was Alan's. He had written it a few weeks after his first stroke 7 years ago. He must have hidden it here between the lives we built and the ones we dreamed of. His words were simple. If anything ever happens to me, don't keep living for someone else's comfort. You gave me everything. Promise me you'll take what's left of your story and make it yours. I sat on the floor for a long while. The letter in my lap, the silence heavy around me. I had told myself I was moving in with Travis and Ellie to recover, to simplify. But the truth was, I didn't know what life looked like without this store, without the daily rhythm of being needed. That letter became the final box I packed. Travis came the next day to help me move. He brought Ellie and their daughter Isabel. I watched him carry my old typewriter to the trunk, talking casually about his coworker's promotion. Ellie stood by the passenger door, arms crossed, already scrolling through her phone. Isabel looked up at me and asked if I was sad. I said no. But something in her eyes told me she knew better. As we pulled away, I looked back through the rain-blurred window at the bookstore's faded sign. The letters were peeling. The life inside had already begun to fade. Still, I whispered, "Thank you." Sometimes the chapter doesn't end with a period. Sometimes it folds into another story altogether. And this time it was mine to write. The guest room was in the basement. It had no window, just a small lamp and one framed photo of a pine forest that wasn't ours. The mattress was stiff. The air smelled faintly of damp carpet and detergent. I said thank you, but the thank you barely touched my throat. Ellie had left a note taped to the fridge upstairs, house guidelines. It was printed neatly, bullet-pointed, and color-coded. Quiet hours after 900 p.m., no TV in shared spaces, no scented products due to allergies, limit reheating food with strong smells. Guests should clean up immediately after use. The list ended with a smiley face. I folded it and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. Later, I found Travis in the kitchen pouring cereal for Isabel. He gave me a sheepish glance and said, "Ellie just liked things to be clear." I nodded, pretending I understood, but my body hadn't even settled into the couch cushion yet, and I already felt like a tenant on probation. That afternoon, I tried to unpack, but there was no dresser in the basement, just 2 plastic bins labeled seasonal decor and a yoga mat rolled tight against the wall. I kept most things in my suitcase. I laid my books in a row along the ledge above the bed, the spines forming a little skyline of comfort. I overheard Travis on the phone that evening. He was in the hallway speaking low. He said something about updating paperwork, something about making sure everything was in place just in case. Then he said the word Dichuk, Vietnamese for will. I don't know who he was talking to, but his voice had that tone he used when he was nervous, but pretending to be responsible. That night during dinner, Ellie brought up the topic. She said it would really help if I could clarify a few things legally. Nothing major, just a standard power of attorney medical directive, things like that. She mentioned how complicated things got when her aunt passed. Travis added almost as an afterthought that I should consider drafting a new will. Soon something clean, something that wouldn't leave room for confusion down the road. Then he passed me the salad like we were talking about weather. I took the plate. I nodded, but inside something shifted. Not anger, not even disappointment, just a quiet weight pressing down in the center of my chest. I didn't sleep much that night. The basement was too quiet. The heater clicked on and off every 30 minutes. Somewhere above me, pipes groaned like tired bones. In the early hours, I reached for the small box I kept in my bag. Inside was Alan's letter. His handwriting was as shaky as I remembered, and his words echoed in my head like they had been written yesterday. Don't live for their comfort, live for yours. And yet here I was in a windowless room reading a note about refrigerator rules. It happened the following Tuesday. I had placed my teacup too close to the edge of the kitchen counter. I was rinsing a few raspberries for Isabel when I heard it fall. Ceramic against tile, sharp, fast. It broke into 3 neat pieces. Before I could crouch to clean it up, I felt a sudden tap on my shoulder, not a hand the end of a broomstick. "Watch it," Ellie said, voice light, almost playful. But the bristle end was turned away. What touched me was the wood-cold, direct, unmistakable. She stood above me like she was chewing off a pet that got too close to the food. I stayed on my knees for a beat longer than needed, just long enough for the silence to stretch, just long enough to feel it settle. When I looked up, Travis was leaning in the doorway with a banana in his hand. He gave a little smirk, then turned his eyes to the floor. He didn't say a word, just peeled his banana and walked into the dining room. I swept the broken cup into a dustpan and kept wiping the floor long after it was clean. Later that evening, I heard Isabel moving on the stairs. I glanced up and saw her halfway down, frozen in place, clutching the railing. She had seen the whole thing. Our eyes met. She didn't speak. Neither did I. From behind her, Ellie's voice rose. She said something cheerful about folding laundry and told Isabel to come help. Then, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she added, "Grandma's just tired today. She tripped earlier. Clumsy old feet." Isabel hesitated. Then she turned and walked back upstairs, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. I didn't mention the broom. I didn't mention the smirk. Instead, I wiped down the counters and pretended that the cup was old. Anyway, the next day, a neighbor came by to drop off a lemon tart. Ellie invited her in and made coffee. They laughed in the living room, talking about yoga and middle school admissions. When the neighbor asked how long I was visiting, Ellie responded before I could. "Oh, she's helping out with the house while Travis works late. She keeps things running down there." Down there. Not retired bookstore owner, not his mother, just a quiet helper tucked into a basement. I smiled. I always smile in public. It's a habit you learn when you've spent decades holding back opinions for the sake of family. But that night in the basement, I unfolded my old journal and wrote a single line. They are not being cruel. They are being efficient. And I was being forgotten efficiently. The envelope came tucked between a stack of mail coupons, utility bills, an insurance flyer, and then a small cream-colored envelope with careful handwriting. Inside, a folded card with glittery sunflowers. Isabel had written it herself in pencil in the neatest cursive an 11-year-old could manage. "Dear Grandma, thank you for always smelling like cinnamon and reading to me when nobody else had time. I wish I could sit next to you more." I read it 3 times before folding it gently and slipping it into the pocket of my cardigan. My hands lingered over the fabric, warm and soft. That note settled somewhere deep inside me, in a place I had kept locked since leaving my bookshop behind. Later that day, Travis called me upstairs. Ellie was already seated at the dining table, a folder open in front of her pen, lined neatly across the top page. The air felt staged, like I had walked into a meeting I never agreed to join. Travis gestured toward the empty seat across from them. "Mama," he said, too casually. Ellie and I were thinking, that basement room really isn't good for you. No window, no sunlight, and those stairs aren't safe long term. I stayed silent. His tone was too rehearsed. Ellie smiled that polished, practiced kind of smile. "If we move you into the upstairs guest room, you'll have a view of the garden morning light, and it'll be easier for Isabel to visit you." She paused. "We were thinking if you'd consider updating the house deed to include our names, it would make everything simpler in the long run. That way, if anything happens, there won't be any messy paperwork or stress for Travis." She pushed the folder slightly toward me. I didn't touch it. Instead, I looked at the tulips outside the window behind her head. They had started to wilt. April was almost gone. I remembered planting tulips with my husband in front of the bookstore. He always picked yellow ones, the kind that bloomed early and faded fast. I nodded slowly, careful not to give away anything. That room upstairs does sound nicer. Travis exhaled, relieved. Ellie folded the folder back. We'll keep things ready whenever you feel comfortable signing. No pressure. That evening, while I folded laundry in the basement, I found the envelope again in my cardigan pocket. Isabel's words felt like an anchor. Thank you for always smelling like cinnamon. I sat down on the old storage bench. The pile of towels stayed untouched in my lap. I thought about what it meant to be given kindness without conditions. Isabel hadn't asked for anything. She had just remembered. I opened the old trunk in the corner and pulled out a box of my late husband's things, a draft of his last will. My name was written clearly on the line beside sole inheritor, and under that a sticky note in his handwriting, faded and crooked. If anything ever makes you feel small, get back up and write the story yourself. I folded the note next to Isabel's letter. Then I turned the laundry machine on and watched the water fill. The upstairs room might have sunlight, but the price was written in pen, and I had spent enough of my life paying for space that should have been freely mine. The second time Ellie hit me, it was my hand. It happened in the kitchen just after dinner. I had reached for the broom, trying to sweep the bits of broken crackers Isabel had accidentally spilled. The handle slipped slightly, and as I went to adjust it, Ellie turned. Sharply yanked it from my grip, and with one swift motion, the end of it smacked the back of my wrist. I didn't cry out. I didn't say a word. My hand pulsed with a dull ache, the sting spreading up my arm, slow and quiet, like a bruise still thinking itself into being. Travis had already gone upstairs. He had excused himself with a yawn, saying he had to catch up on emails. Ellie didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She only said almost casually, "It's dangerous when you wave things around like that. You're lucky Isabel wasn't standing nearby." And then she left the room as if nothing had happened. I sat at the edge of the breakfast nook, staring at the tiles beneath my feet, each one a pale gray cold to the touch, just like the way Ellie looked through me most days. A few minutes later, I heard a soft shuffle behind the curtain that separated the kitchen from the hallway. Isabel stepped out holding a small first aid box. She didn't say anything right away. Her eyes moved to my wrist. Then she opened the box, took out a cold compress, and gently pressed it into my palm. Her hands were careful, too careful for an 11-year-old. She wrapped the cloth with slow determination, biting her lower lip the way she always did when she was concentrating. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. I looked at her. Her eyes didn't waver. "I know," I said. She stayed a few seconds longer, then put the box back and walked away. I heard her door close upstairs, soft but certain that night. I didn't sleep. I turned the events over in my mind like pages of a book I hadn't finished writing. The hand that Ellie struck had once written bedtime stories held Isabel close, after fevers folded years of birthday letters into cards filled with lavender and pressed leaves. Now that same hand felt foreign. I went into the corner of the basement where I kept a small chest of old things. I pulled out the draft of a book I never finished, a novel about a woman who starts over in her 70s. It was rough scribbled parts of it smudged from tea or maybe time. I hadn't looked at it in years, but something about tonight pulled me back to that draft. I added a new page at the end in pencil, not pen. She didn't break. I wrote. She bent quietly, and then she gathered herself, stood straighter than before, and chose her own next chapter. My hand still throbbed, but my mind didn't. There was a clarity settling in now, the kind that comes not from anger, but from something colder and more precise. I folded Isabel's letter next to the new page, tucked it back into the envelope, and placed it atop the chest. Then I turned off the basement light, one finger pressing gently on the switch, as if to say, "This part ends here." Tomorrow, I would begin to make quiet preparations. No announcements, no drama, just decisions. Because the second time someone hits you, you stop asking why. You start answering for yourself. The attic had always been off limits. Ellie once told me it was just for storage and too dusty for someone with fragile lungs. But that morning, when the house emptied for a school field trip and a conference, I climbed the stairs anyway. I moved slow, steady, careful not to make the old boards creak too loud beneath my feet. The attic door stuck a little, but I pushed through. It smelled like cardboard and mothballs, familiar in a way that twisted my chest. Afternoon light filtered in through a small, round window, hazy with cobwebs. I scanned the boxes, each one labeled with Travis's neat handwriting photos: high school holiday decor, books, college. Toward the back, tucked beneath a broken lamp and a trunk missing its latch, I saw one with my name written in faded black marker. Mom, old papers. Inside, I found my husband's handwriting, first a folder marked Will 2011. Beneath it, his old pocket notebook, the leather peeling at the edges. I opened it and saw familiar notes about the shop inventory, scribbled quotes from poets he loved, and then his message to me. If I go first, let her write. Let her live where she wants. Let her start again if that's what she needs. I closed the notebook gently. My hands shook. Behind the folder, I found the manuscript I thought I had lost during our last move. My own draft, yellowed and stained pages still clipped together with an old, rusted binder. It wasn't a novel anymore. It felt more like a map, a version of myself I had tried to bury after his funeral. I flipped through and found the last thing I had written. She waited, not because she had to, but because she hoped someone would see her again, not just walk past her. I sat down on a stool and breathed in the attic's dry air. Nya. Then I pulled a blank page from the back of the folder. I didn't think I just wrote. I am not writing fiction anymore. I am writing what is real. About women who are silenced. About women who are labeled burdens. About those who vanish inside their own homes. By the time I finished, my handwriting was tighter, more certain. I placed the new page back with the old draft, slid it into a padded envelope, and tucked it into my bag. That night, Ellie commented on the dust in my hair. I smiled faintly and said I'd been going through some boxes of my husband's things. She looked momentarily surprised, then returned to stirring her tea. Travis didn't look up from his phone. Later in my room, I opened my laptop. The password was still the name of our old bookstore. I created a folder titled The Second Chapter. I scanned the new pages into it, then copied our original deed papers for the house we sold just in case. When I was done, I folded the letter from my husband and tucked it into my nightstand drawer. No one would know what I was building yet, but something had shifted. I was no longer just someone waiting for kindness. I was a woman in motion, gathering the broken pieces of herself in the quietest room of the house, preparing for something far louder than grief. Tomorrow, I would make a call, and the day after, I would begin again, not to escape, but to reclaim. It was still dark when I zipped my old suitcase shut. The house slept in silence save for the low hum of the refrigerator. I moved without noise, folding my nightgown and last cardigan into the side pouch. Every movement felt deliberate, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I had taken too long to finish. I didn't write a note. There wasn't a point. Downstairs, I stopped by the hallway mirror. My reflection startled me, not because of age or wear, but because I finally recognized the woman looking back, the one who had been hiding under layers of politeness and deflection. I tucked the collar of my coat, slid my hand across the banister, and took one last step into the kitchen. The moonlight touched the countertop where Ellie's schedule list still hung. Clean fridge vitamins for Mom Lock Garage. I gently removed the list and folded it once before dropping it into the trash. I opened the back door. A soft sound behind me made me turn. Isabel, she stood at the edge of the hallway, small frame wrapped in her fuzzy robe hair, tousled. Her eyes were wide but calm. She didn't ask anything. Instead, she stepped closer and held out something small, a bookmark made from cardboard, hand-drawn flowers, and glitter glue. It read, "I believe you." I took it slowly, pressing it between my fingers like it might disappear. My voice caught, so I just nodded. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. Her hug was quick but fierce, the kind that lingered long after. Then without a word, she turned and padded back toward her room. I stood there for another breath. Then I stepped out. The street was quiet sky, just beginning to pale with morning. I walked to the bus stop 2 blocks down. My suitcase rolled softly against the concrete. No one else was out yet. The air was crisp and cool. I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel guilty, just clear. On the bus, I sat near the window and pulled out the envelope with the pages I had written. I added Isabel's bookmark to the top. I had packed her drawing beside my husband's letter. Somehow, both now felt like compass points. When the bus turned out of the neighborhood, I looked back once, not to mourn, but to mark it done. I didn't belong in that house anymore. Not in the basement, not in the attic, not in the margins of someone else's story. I arrived at the old bookstore space just before sunrise. The key still turned easily. Inside it smelled of time and dust and paper. My name still sat faintly on the awning above the door. I stood in the center of the empty space, my suitcase beside me. For a moment, I simply listened. Then I set the bag down and opened the back room. The shelves were still intact. A few old labels clung to their corners. I touched the nearest one. Poetry. It was a beginning, not a return, not a retreat. The second chapter. Not in fiction, but in life. The morning light crept through the dusty blinds as I stood in the center of the old shop. My suitcase was still near the door, but my hands were already busy. I wasn't sorting books anymore. I was sorting purpose. The stillness of the store felt different now. Not heavy, not lonely, just waiting. I started by cleaning the windows, one pane at a time. Then I cleared out the back office. There, under a pile of yellowed receipts and forgotten mailing lists, I found the business license with my name still printed across the top. It felt like shaking hands with an old version of myself, one I wasn't ready to let go of after all. By the end of the week, the shelves were scrubbed, the dust gone. I put out a small card table near the entrance, just enough for a coffee pot and a sign that read, "Free coffee, free news." I didn't have many visitors at first, just one or two older women who peeked in and asked if it was reopening. I told them not as a store, not exactly. They nodded curious. Some stayed for coffee, others left quietly. I let the pace be slow. That Sunday, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Her name was Leanne Park. She had once been a customer, but she was also an attorney. I remembered her from the time I almost sold the bookstore after my husband passed. She was the one who told me to hold off to take time before signing anything. I called her office and left a message. She called back that evening. Her voice was warm but direct. She remembered me right away. We met the next afternoon at the folding table. I poured coffee. She didn't ask questions, just listened as I explained what I wanted to build. Not a charity, not just a reading group, a foundation, a space for women, especially older women who had been ignored, silenced, or made to feel invisible. I wanted to offer something that gave them tools not just to write their stories, but to protect their lives. Legal guidance, estate planning resources to understand their rights, support groups for emotional and financial abuse survivors. A place where their voice didn't have to be loud to be heard. Leanne leaned back, crossed her arms, and smiled. She said she'd help. No fee, just a promise that I wouldn't give up halfway. That night, I wrote the words at the top of my notebook, the second chapter foundation, and underneath. For every woman who thought her story ended with someone else's decision. The following week, a few women came back. They brought friends. One of them asked if she could use the old poetry corner to host a journaling workshop. I cleared the space for her. Another woman wanted to host a talk on setting boundaries with adult children. I nodded. It was all beginning. I set up a small donation jar, not for money, for stories. Little scraps of paper with anonymous notes started to appear. I haven't spoken to my daughter in 5 years. My son took control of my bank account. I miss being called by my first name. I read each one in silence, folded them, gently filed them under hope. By the end of the month, the sign on the window changed, not closed, not bookstore. It read the second chapter foundation, quiet voices, real power, and underneath a hand-drawn bookmark taped beside it. I knew that handwriting. I had kept the original in my bag. This one was a copy. It still read, "I believe you." And this time, I wasn't the only one who did. The call came on a Tuesday morning. A producer from a regional public affairs program had heard about the Second Chapter Foundation through a community referral. She wanted to feature the work we were doing, but only if I felt safe and comfortable sharing my story. I told her I would do it under one condition. I wouldn't show my face. I didn't need to. My voice and the voices of the women who walked through that door were more than enough. The The segment aired on a quiet Thursday evening. I didn't even have a television in the shop anymore. But within hours, my phone started ringing. Women from all over the state left messages. They said things like, "I didn't know I was allowed to say no. My daughter says I complain too much, but now I think she just doesn't want to hear the truth. I thought I was alone. I returned as many calls as I could. Leanne offered to help organize a small group for those who wanted to talk more privately. By the weekend, we had over 60 names on a list. Some left voicemails in shaky voices. Some sent handwritten notes. Some just came and stood at the door, looking in with wet eyes before walking away, but they had found the address. That was enough for now. Word traveled further than I expected. A local newspaper followed with a short piece. Then a national blog reposted the video. Within 2 days, the foundation's website crashed from too many visits. I didn't know that back in the house where I used to live, Ellie was pacing the living room with the TV remote in her hand. The screen showed a blurry shot of the foundation's front window, and my voice telling a story not mine by name, but familiar enough that Ellie recognized every word. Travis sat on the edge of the couch, staring. She muttered something like, "She's trying to make us look like monsters." He didn't answer. She said louder, "You're going to let her drag our family through the mud." But Travis was still looking at the screen. He didn't see the mess or the shame or the headlines. He saw the bookmark, the one that read, "I believe you." And for a moment, he saw something else. His daughter Isabel slipping that very thing into my suitcase, thinking no one would notice. He rose quietly and left the room. Back at the shop, I was folding chairs after a small gathering when Leanne walked in holding her phone. She showed me a photo from the broadcast, the sign on the window, the coffee table. A shot of me from the back, speaking to a group of women seated in a circle. She said, "You know this is bigger than just a foundation now, don't you?" I didn't reply. I just looked around the room at the worn carpet, the old shelves, the faces I had come to know, the stack of new submissions for the writing circle. Stories not about revenge, but survival, clarity, peace. I turned back to her and nodded. This wasn't just a second chapter. It was a whole new book, and we were still writing. The calls came every evening around 600. Always the same number, always silence after 2 rings if I didn't answer. Ellie never left a voicemail. Travis did once. It was short. He said he hoped I was safe, that Isabel had been asking about me, and then he added awkwardly that maybe we could meet for lunch sometime. I never responded, not because I was bitter, but because I didn't want to lose the clarity I had earned. By then, I was helping women every day, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, ordinary ways that matter most. There was Angela, a retired teacher who had signed over her apartment to her youngest son and was now sleeping on a friend's couch. There was Maria, who still cooked and cleaned for a daughter-in-law who called her useless. And there was Uni. Unji had come into the foundation on a rainy Tuesday. She barely spoke English and held her purse like it might vanish from her hands. Leanne offered her tea, and I sat with her near the heater in the back. It took us a while using simple words and drawings and gestures, but eventually I understood. She had flown in from Korea 2 years ago to live with her son. She cooked for him, took care of his children, gave up her pension, and when she asked to visit her sister in Chicago, he told her no, that she couldn't go anywhere, that she didn't belong here. Now she wanted to leave, but she had no documents, no income, no voice. That afternoon, I didn't return any calls. I spent the entire day helping Unji fill out forms. With the help of a volunteer translator, we contacted a women's shelter that provided language assistance and temporary housing. We printed copies of her passport and helped her write a letter to the consulate. When we finished, she placed her hand over mine and whispered the only 2 English words she knew clearly. "Thank you." It was enough to carry me through the rest of the week. Later that night, I walked through the quiet space of the foundation. A group of women were folding brochures for our next workshop. Leanne was sorting through a stack of notebooks. I paused by the front window where we had a small display of used books. In the center sat a copy of the second chapter journal, not for sale, just for a reminder that I had made it out, that others could too. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Travis again. This time, I didn't even look at the message, not because I didn't care, but because I was already exactly where I was supposed to be. And there are moments when silence is not absence, it is presence. Not every story ends with reconciliation. Some just continue with peace. And that I had finally learned was more than enough. One afternoon, while I was reviewing intake forms in the quiet corner of the foundation, Leanne walked over with a small envelope in her hand. It had no return address, just my name in a child's handwriting. Inside was a thin booklet, folded paper stapled together. On the front, in uneven blue ink, were the words, Chapter 1.5 by Isabel Lindell. My chest tightened before I even opened the first page. It wasn't a story, not really. Just short paragraphs drawn with little sketches in between. A sun, through a window, a woman on a couch reading a figure standing alone in a room. But the words held more weight than many books I'd read in my life. She wrote about the night she watched me packing my bags, how she wanted to say something but didn't know if she was allowed. She wrote about how the house felt colder after I left, how her mom said I was just being dramatic, and how that didn't feel true. She remembered the night Ellie raised her voice and I stood silent. She wrote that she didn't know why adults acted like that, but she hoped she would be different. At the bottom of the last page, there was a single drawing, a bookmark the same one she had left in my suitcase weeks ago, and next to it, written carefully, I still believe you. I sat there for a long time holding that booklet in both hands, the paper soft and a little wrinkled like it had been opened and folded again and again. It wasn't just a note from a child. It was a thread of hope, proof that something I did reached someone, that silence wasn't empty. Later that week, I placed a small envelope in the outgoing mail tray. Inside, I tucked a fresh notebook and a short letter. I told Isabel I had read every word. I told her I was proud of her voice, and I told her to keep writing, not for anyone else's approval, but because her voice mattered. When I returned to my desk, I looked at the framed cover of our foundation's first publication, but now hanging on the wall. Below the title in small print were the words written by those who were told to be quiet. It reminded me why I started all this, not to be heard louder, but to remind women and girls like Isabel that their truth didn't have to wait for permission, that their second chapter could start whenever they were ready. And sometimes it began with something as simple as picking up a pen. The bell above the shop door chimed gently. It was late afternoon sunlight spilling through the windows in long, quiet lines. I didn't look up right away. I was organizing a box of donated books, most of them old paperbacks that smelled of dust and warm attic air. Then I heard her voice. "Hi, Grandma." I turned, and there she was. Isabel stood in the doorway holding something in her hand. She had grown taller in just a few months, her hair pulled into the same messy braid I used to help her with before school. Her eyes were a little unsure, but her feet stayed planted. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked up to me and opened her palm. Inside was the bookmark, the same one she had slipped into my suitcase when I left her house. I held my breath, but she spoke before I could say a word. I kept it with me. I thought maybe one day I'd give it back. She didn't say why. She didn't have to. I knelt down and opened my arms. She stepped into them, and I wrapped her tight against my chest. I could feel her shoulders relax as she rested her head on me. It wasn't the same kind of reunion you see in stories. There were no big speeches, no dramatic music, just quiet, real. When we pulled apart, I told her she could stay for a while. I had tea brewing in the back and a whole stack of books that needed sorting. She nodded, and we walked toward the back room together. As we passed the bookshelf near the window, she glanced at the foundation's mission plaque on the wall. Her fingers brushed the edge of it before she turned and smiled at me. That smile felt like the first line of something new. And as we settled into the afternoon, I realized this chapter wasn't ending at all. It was simply turning a page. If you've ever felt like your voice was dismissed, like you had to stay quiet to keep the peace, then maybe you understand what Marjorie carried. Her journey is one of many, but perhaps it echoes something in you, too. What does your second chapter look like? When did you last feel heard? If this story stayed with you, I'd love for you to share it, because someone out there might be waiting to find their voice through yours. Thank you for listening.